Emmerdale teased that the web of deception spun through the quiet hills of Yorkshire was far more intricate than anyone had imagined. Beneath the idyllic veneer of home farm and the sleepy valley it towered over, secrets were twisting into place, like cogs in Kim Tate's masterful design. The chill of her intellect had long been underestimated, but now, with her sights set on expanding the Tate legacy, she was ready to make her next move. Her weapon of choice. Not brute force, but manipulation, loyalty earned through cunning, and alliances that masqueraded as chance encounters. Dr. Crowley was never truly Dr. Crowley. His presence in the village, as subtle as it had been unsettling, was never happenstance. Disguised as Eddie, he had insinuated himself into the lives of unsuspecting residents, carefully prying open their vulnerabilities. His blackmail schemes were whispered about in dark corners of the pub, always just out of reach of proof, until now. Kim had known from the beginning. Not only known, she had orchestrated the entire charade. Crowley, under Kim's directive, had become the perfect pawn, pressuring residents into desperation, testing the boundaries of control. But his arrogance was his undoing. He believed himself to be a free agent, playing a game of shadows. He never realized he was the shadow, cast by Kim's far-reaching light. The revelation sent ripples through those who had unknowingly crossed paths with him. But for Joe Tate, it was a turning point. His earlier dealings with Crowley had almost left him destitute and disgraced. What he didn't know then, and had only recently discovered, was that Kim had been pulling strings behind the scenes, using Crowley to isolate Joe, only to come to his rescue at the pivotal moment. When the trap closed on Crowley, Joe found his freedom, but it came with a price. Gratitude. Kim had engineered his salvation with precision, and in return, Joe felt indebted, perhaps even inspired. For all her ruthlessness, there was a clarity to Kim's ambition that Joe could admire. In the power vacuum left behind by Crowley's exposure, Kim stepped in with her next move. She had already briefed Joe, vaguely, on her latest vision, to secure the surrounding lands of home farm. Her tone had been guarded, her words carefully chosen. "There's change coming, Joe," she had said one evening, staring out across the rolling hills. "And I intend to be ahead of it." She hadn't elaborated then, but the implication was clear. She had insider knowledge. Something was brewing that would reframe the value of the farmland not as quaint, agricultural plots, but as commercial gold. Joe understood what was at stake. This wasn't simply about expanding home farm's perimeter. This was about empire building. Kim had hinted at governmental rezoning, whispers of infrastructure changes, transport links, or industrial projects. If she could secure the land before the shift occurred, she would be poised to profit in unimaginable ways. He was tasked with the acquisition. Quietly, methodically. Most parcels were easily secured. Old farmers, tempted by generous offers, shook Joe's hand with relief. Others, sensing something beneath the surface, hesitated but eventually gave in. All except one. Moira Dingle. Her land, nestled in a key location, stood as the last piece of the puzzle. Moira, fiercely independent, had always prided herself on her ability to stand her ground. Her bond with the soil was not financial, but spiritual, born from years of toil, loss, and rebuilding. She refused the offer outright, even when the numbers kept climbing. "It's not about money," she told Joe. "This land means something. You don't get to buy that." But Kim wasn't deterred. She never expected Moira to fold so easily. Kane, as ever, stood firm beside her. His presence was both comfort and warning. He had made his feelings known. Kim wasn't welcome, and Joe was to back off. But Kim had played the long game before. If Moira couldn't be bought, perhaps she could be broken. Joe's orders were clear. Pressure Moira. Not through threats, that would only galvanize her. but through subtle sabotage. Disrupt her routines. Strain her operations. Drive her to the edge where desperation might do what money couldn't. Already, Kim had laid the groundwork. Supply chains for Moira's livestock were being delayed. Machinery repairs that should have taken days now dragged into weeks. Regulatory inspectors were showing up unannounced, citing minor infractions. The cracks were forming. Moira, proud as she was, began to feel the weight. Her herd required feed she couldn't store. Workers she relied on were being poached by higher-paying competitors suspiciously connected to Kim's network. Even Kane, watching his wife deteriorate under the pressure, began to suspect this was more than bad luck. Still, Moira held the line. Joe, however, was not the same man he had once been. He didn't relish the role of antagonist. But loyalty to Kim, and perhaps his own craving for redemption, kept him in motion. He started showing up more, feigning concern, offering help that came with veiled strings. He would watch Moira's face, searching for signs of surrender, and find instead the steel of a woman unwilling to be moved. But every wall has its fault lines. And as Joe observed her struggles, he began to feel a flicker of doubt. Was this the legacy Kim wanted, domination through suffering? Could Moira truly be an acceptable casualty in the making of the Tate dynasty? Kim, as always, was watching. She saw the hesitation in Joe's eyes. And she reminded him, quietly and coldly, what was at stake. Empires aren't built on kindness, Joe. They are built on clarity. And so the pressure mounted. Kim's influence extended beyond the village. She had aligned herself with financial backers, who had their own reasons for seeing the land redeveloped. These weren't just investors, they were strategists, developers, and politicians who understood the value of subtlety. They needed someone like Kim to do their dirty work, and in return, they would open doors she couldn't reach alone. Meanwhile, Crowley, now exposed, became a liability. But Kim had anticipated this. Before he could spill secrets, he was discredited, found to be involved in a series of unrelated frauds in other counties. His name blackened, his influence gone, he vanished from the village under the cloud of disgrace, never realizing how thoroughly he had been used. For Joe, the days grew heavier. Each time he passed Moira's land, he saw not just opportunity, but cost. Her children helping in the fields. The quiet moments, when she thought no one was watching, and wiped exhaustion from her eyes. And he wondered how far he was willing to go to fulfill a promise to a woman who might never truly accept him. But Kim had more in store. The final move was yet to be made. She hinted at a new phase, not just acquisition, but transformation. Plans were being drawn. Blueprints. Proposals. Soon, even the locals would begin to notice. Yet one thing remained clear. If Moira wouldn't sell, then Kim would make it so that she had no choice. Even if it meant turning every friend Moira had into a threat, every asset into a liability, and every bit of peace she held onto into a battleground. And somewhere, in the heart of it all, Joe stood torn between loyalty, legacy, and his own morality. The days bled into one another, and the pressure on Moira's shoulders grew heavier with each passing week. The once fertile land she nurtured now yielded less, not because of the earth itself, but due to the growing chain of problems encircling her. The unseen hand behind it all had grown bolder, inspections came with larger fines, feed deliveries went missing, and machinery repairs were so delayed that manual labor had to stretch beyond its limits. Kane, watchful and furious, began to connect the dots. His gut told him that Kim was involved, even if she never appeared directly. But Kane knew something else too. Kim rarely acted alone. If she wanted someone hurt, someone else delivered the pain. And that someone was Joe. Kane confronted Joe once, words laced with veiled threats, the old fire in his eyes. Joe said little in response, but the silence was damning. There was guilt there, something hesitant that Kane couldn't ignore. But Joe wasn't folding either. He had his orders, and Kim's influence still anchored him. Behind the scenes, Kim watched the tension rise like steam in a sealed chamber. She thrived in these moments, when good people were cornered into bad decisions. But there was a layer even deeper to her plan, a phase Joe wasn't yet fully aware of. The land was not just for development, it was leverage. Moira's land, in particular, was located in a corridor that would soon be declared a strategic transit route. Kim had advance notice from her contacts, politicians who owed her, planners whose votes had been purchased long before the public ever heard the whispers of rezoning. She didn't need the land to be profitable. She needed it to be hers when the announcement came. Every delay, every refusal from Moira, only threatened the timeline, but not the outcome. Kim had never lost a war she prepared for. Joe, however, was beginning to lose sight of the goal. One afternoon, he watched Moira arguing with a contractor who had failed to deliver promised repairs. Her voice broke, not in weakness, but in weariness. She looked over at Joe then, not with hate, but with exhaustion. A silent accusation. That evening, Joe visited Home Farm. He found Kim alone in the study, a glass of wine in her hand, the room filled with blueprints and maps. He asked her, plainly, earnestly, if there was no other way. Couldn't they offer Moira something else? Partnership, profit sharing, anything but this slow, cruel squeeze. Kim barely looked at him. You're not here to rewrite the rules, Joe. You're here to enforce them. But she's not the enemy, he said. No, Kim said with a quiet smile, she's just in the way. Meanwhile, Moira sought help. Not from the authorities, they were already on Kim's payroll, or at least her influence. But from Kane, whose past made him a dangerous man to push. He began reaching out, subtly, to those few remaining in the village who hadn't yet fallen under Kim's sway. They started to watch, listen, trace the movements of Joe and his associates. It was Moira who uncovered the blueprint. Hidden among discarded documents in a temporary contractor's van, she found a site plan that detailed not just her land, but the adjoining fields, outlined in bold, earmarked for commercial development. It was signed off by a company she had never heard of, but a quick search revealed it was owned by a shell corporation tied to Kim's private holding company. The betrayal hit hard. Not just from Joe, whom she had once thought was better than this, but from the village itself. How had everyone let it go this far? How had she become so isolated? She showed the plans to Kane. His reaction was volcanic. But rage wasn't enough. They needed leverage, something Kim couldn't buy, control, or silence. And that's when Kane suggested an old tactic: fight fire with fire. They began gathering their own intelligence. Moira approached one of the contractors. A young man named Ethan, who had grown uneasy with the tactics he was being asked to employ. She promised him protection, even a job on her farm, if he could get her documents linking Kim to the bribery of zoning officials. Ethan, torn but tired of the guilt, agreed. Within a week, he handed over a USB drive. Inside were communications between Kim and a planning officer, subtle but damning, including early drafts of the zoning proposal and projected profits tied directly to the acquisition of Moira's land. It was enough to at least raise suspicion in the right places. Joe was summoned again by Kim. This time, her demeanor had shifted. She had caught wind of Moira's new resistance and suspected someone had broken ranks. She tasked Joe with handling it, permanently. I need her land secured, and I need it now. No more delays, Joe. You have enough dirt on Kane. Use it. Threaten his freedom if you have to. But Joe hesitated. Something in him cracked. He had followed Kim because he believed in the vision, not the cost. He didn't want to destroy people, he wanted to build something. This wasn't legacy, it was bloodless conquest. That night, Joe drove to Butler's farm. Kane met him at the edge of the property, fists clenched, ready for another confrontation. But Joe held up his hands. "I'm not here to fight," he said. "I'm here to fix what I broke." Moira appeared behind Kane, her face cautious. Joe handed her a folder, everything he had on Kim's plan. Names, companies, bank transfers. Proof. "Use it," he said, "before she makes her next move." Kane still didn't trust him. Moira didn't thank him. But they took the folder. The next morning, Moira and Kane met with a solicitor in Leeds, one who had no connections to the village. A private injunction was filed to pause any further planning applications involving her land. Simultaneously, a complaint was submitted to the local council, and the planning officer in question was suspended pending investigation. Kim was furious. Her plans had been exposed, not entirely derailed, but publicly scrutinized. That alone was enough to scare some of her investors. One pulled out. Another delayed funding. The cracks were beginning to form on her side now. She confronted Joe, rage-cold and quiet. "You gave them the files." "I gave them the truth," he said. "You gave away everything I built." "No," he replied. "You built nothing. You took it. And I'm done helping you steal." Kim's face hardened. "You've just made an enemy, Joe. And I never forget betrayal." Joe left home farm that night, uncertain of what would come next. But as he walked away, the weight on his chest lifted, just a little. Back at Butler's farm, Moira resumed her work. The repairs were slow, the pressure hadn't vanished, but the tide had shifted. Kane stayed close, always watching, always ready. The war wasn't over, Kim would never concede defeat. But for the first time in weeks, Moira stood on her land with a sense of power. And somewhere, in the shadows of a study lined with glass and steel, Kim Tate rewrote her plans, crossing out names, drawing new lines, because if one battle had failed, another would begin soon. She had not lost. She had adapted. And Kim Tate never played the same hand twice.